I first worked with Danny on a TV series called Mr. Rose Virgins, which came out of the blue. I was living in America at the time, and I had come back over to England to do a few commercials. And just before I was due to go back home, my agent called me and said she'd had an inquiry from a producer at the BBC about a series that he was planning to do out of Manchester, and was I interested? And I said only if I could read the script first, or the scripts first. So they biked them over to me, and I thought it was the best thing I'd read since I'd left the BBC. And events moved forward. I went for a meeting with the producer, who introduced me to his new director, who turned out to be Danny, of course. And they said they would like me to do the series. So I went home, got all my stuff together, and then came back over and worked with Danny for quite a few months, actually, based in Manchester. And on the basis of that, he asked me if I would do Shallow Grave. So he asked me to go and meet Andrew MacDonald to discuss, how we would proceed with that and the best way of doing it. So it was a very limited budget and a very limited schedule. And that was the start of it. Imaginative, creative, open to listening to ideas, and taking those ideas, no matter who they come from, really. If there's anything of value in there, he will take it out and move on and advance it, make it even better. It's very, very visually imaginative. Well, it was a different project, a different story completely. And of course, in Shallow Grave, the apartment was in fact a character. That was the way Danny, myself, and Cave Quinn, the production designer, approached it, which was why it was so important to sort of get that right, and to shoot it in, I hesitate to use the word studio, because it was an old warehouse, as always. But, we made it work. And we had to, spend the money on the set because it was as important as the actors, in a sense, because that was what the plot was all about. And we wanted it to look, very kind of cinematic. But on Trainspotting, of course, it was a whole different sort of story and different approach to a problem, in a sense. But we still wanted to make it look big. And Danny was a man of few words in those days. I don't know if he still is. In the brief that he gives to his, the people working around him. And in Trainspotting, it was the work of Francis Bacon and Munch's The Scream. And I've just come back from Glasgow, working with heroin addicts in rehab. They spend most of their life on the floor. I want you to find a way of making the camera hoover along the floor all the time, as much as possible. And those were the challenges. So Cave and I looked at each other about Francis Bacon and decided that what he was saying was open your minds and be imaginative. Hoovering the camera along the floor was a bit more complicated, simply because we didn't have money or the time to use fancy equipment. So most of it was done handheld. In fact, almost all of it was done handheld. Being open-minded about, the structure of the film, the use of cinematic language, was to take it and push it in, onto another level, hopefully, which is what we achieved, without making it unwatchable, for the public and for the audience. And it was just about being imaginative with the camera, really, and to sort of get it into sort of places and get the shots that Danny had in his mind. I don't know, how would I best describe it? Sheer admiration, I think, really. Ewan really threw himself into the part. He lost so much weight to make himself look authentic. And no, just admiration for actors anyway in general, because you know they're taking on the role of another person, which, I mean, I wouldn't even have a clue as how to achieve that. I mean, music plays a really big part in Danny's life, and I was aware of that from the very first, time we worked together, and on the recce's for Mr. Rose Virgins, and then became very apparent on Shallow Grave, and more so on Trainspotting. So you are aware, possibly aware, of how the thing is going to be cut together, when you're doing it. So, plus the whole thing about Trainspotting was, the whole thing is just dynamic. So my aim was to make the visual as dynamic as possible, keep the camera moving in whatever way, enhance the particular scene and move the whole thing forward onto the next scene. Well, I, as a cinematographer, I always work very closely with the production designers on the film, and Cave, Quinn and myself had a very close working relationship to achieve the look that Danny wants for his films. In Shallow Grave, for instance, it was Edward Hopper. It was as simple as that. And there's one particular sequence where I think Cave and I managed to pull that off to its best advantage. And in Trainspotting, it was more open. We had, as always, we had an open palette. So we came up with ideas and then presented them to Danny, and he either said yes or no, or let's try this or try whatever. So we decided on that colour palette long before, when I say long before, obviously in pre-production. And so Cave and I, what we do is paint large sheets of board, about 0.5 metre to 1 metre square, with different colours, and then I film them. And we just look at them and say, well, yeah, maybe that and that would go for this particular character. We decided on characters, because in the location that these heroin addicts lived, in the real location just outside of Edinburgh, what they've done is, or what they did, I don't know if it still exists, they had really commandeered blocks of council estates, the flats, and then knocked through from one apartment into another. So there's this massive maze of apartments, which basically you could go from one to the other without going outside. So that was how we built the set. And then we, discussed with Danny the idea that we would create a colour for each character, because each character had their own space within the set, within the apartment, as it were. And we kind of proceeded from there, really. But the colours were always muted, apart from the Mother Superior character, whose domain was the kitchen, basically. And we had red filters on the windows, the sort of thing they may have done, to brighten the place up. In the end, I ended up with a motorbike with what I don't know if you younger guys know this about this thing called a sidecar, that you would come on a motorbike, but it wasn't. I mean, it was a specially adapted platform, almost at ground level, so that I could lie on it, and then they strapped me to it with scaffold poles, because you've got a scaffold ring around it, and I could handhold the camera at pavement level going down Princess Street. And the police up in Scotland are absolutely fantastic when it comes to making films. It's a pity the police down here don't take a lesson from it. It was done with such ease and with no stress, no aggravation, nothing. The police just controlled the people on Princess Street, and obviously we took as many precautions as possible. We didn't want to run anybody over, but it was quite a dangerous thing to pull off. So it is amazing how fast people run. The acts of running, and it was sometimes difficult to keep up with them. I think I preferred Danny's first cut, which was extremely long. And then when I saw the final, cut, it obviously moved along a lot faster, a lot more pace to it, because a whole load of stuff had been lost in the process, as always when you're editing. That which seemed absolutely so important when you're shooting a film, suddenly, isn't there for whatever reason. Usually one of time and, again, pace. I mean, the whole thing about Trainspotting is the pace at which it moves along. No, absolutely not. I mean, when you're making films, you never know what's going to happen to them. But there was one moment that sticks in my memory vividly. We had been shooting a scene which takes place within the film after Renton and Spud have been up in court, and Spud has been sent down, and Renton has been let off because, with God's help, he would overcome this affliction. And it's quite it's an interesting scene where they're sitting in a pub celebrating the fact that Renton has not been sent to prison, and Spud's mother appears, and there was an interchange of dialogue between Robert Carlyle, who expressed his views as to why Spud had gone down, and we were watching it we weren't taking much notice of it while we were shooting it, because we were concerned about getting it done on schedule and everything else, and Danny with the performances, and me trying to achieve a shot which was virtually impossible. And so the next day we were watching the rushes at lunchtime in Andrew's office, and we watched the scene, and the language was quite colourful. And when we switched the machine off, Andrew said, "I think we better be seen to be shooting A Life Less Ordinary when this comes out, otherwise we'll never work again."